Okay, this screencast is going to begin with the Korean War, so you might be able to kind of pass this section up if your class got to this. So just because a couple of my classes did make it past the Korean War. So if you kind of recall, Japan was very aggressive in Asia during the Second World War, and Korea, which is a small Asian nation that kind of extends off of northeastern China. You can see that zoomed in on this map. Korea was one of those countries. It used to be unified into one single Korea. Because it needed some assistance with rebuilding in the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to divide Korea at the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union taking responsibility for rebuilding the northern half and the United States taking responsibility for rebuilding the southern half. And so we can safely assume that while the Soviet Union was occupying North Korea, they were implementing communism while we were promoting a democracy in South Korea. In the late 40s, both the Soviets and the United States withdrew their forces from both sides of Korea, leaving North Korea communist and South Korea democratic. But by the turn of the 40s into the 50s, North Korea actually invaded South Korea, not the Soviets, the actual Koreans themselves. The North Koreans invaded South Korea and with the hopes of reuniting the nation once more under communism and bringing communism into South Korea. Because of our policy of containment, the U.S. desired to prevent this spread from happening, and so we began to send forces into South Korea to push back the North Koreans back above the 38th parallel, which is known as the event of the Korean War. So in our Korean War, we actually do send American forces into South Korea to push the communists out of South Korea. We do successfully do this under the leadership of Douglas MacArthur, and the 38th parallel is the line of latitude that leaves Korea divided today, with the North remaining communist and the South remaining democratic. I also wanted to add that Vietnam is a kind of third example of this. We're going to talk about it in much greater detail in a later unit, so I don't want you to think I'm skipping it, but much like the Korean War, the Vietnam War is very similar to be a like war within the Cold War, because we were fighting because of policies of containment. Okay, now there we go. Okay, now I'm going to ask that you pause your screencast and add this little section of notes before McCarthyism and the Red Scare to your outline. So this little few bullet points, the Cold War at home with these bullets underneath, are just going to go underneath your outline. Go underneath the section we just finished. Okay, we're going to start by talking about the GI Bill. So the GI Bill was actually passed towards the end of World War II. By the way, these notes are going to discuss kind of how America's economy in the 40s adjusted in the aftermath of World War II. So the purpose was to help ease veterans' return to civilian life. I think America learned a lot of lessons after the Great War and wanted to correct some of those wrongdoings and try to help, veterans get readjusted to civilian life. It encouraged veterans to get an education by helping to pay part of their tuition, also getting them unemployment benefits if they had trouble finding a job, also helping them buy their first homes, for their families, or, establish their own businesses. So basically, financial assistance to the veterans returning home from war in making a life for themselves. And this is actually something that's still here today. If you, enlist or you get a degree and become an officer or get commissioned to one of the branches of the military, you can serve some time and then, go to college or get another degree, like with the GI Bill. Or get a home loan through because of the GI Bill. So the GI Bill is a huge benefits package available to veterans today, and it is something created at the end of World War II. There is also a housing crisis when veterans return home. Many families had no other choice but to live in like cramped apartments or move in with relatives. This is kind of the first era of suburbs. In response to the housing crisis, home developers like this man, William Levitt, he would offer homes in small residential communities that were right outside of cities, and we called these suburbs. And because of the use of the automobile, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, suburbs became a much more like practical living option, since transportation into the cities for work wasn't that far-fetched any longer. President Truman dealt with more than just the economy after World War II. He also wanted to address civil rights. There's a lot of social unrest that erupted after World War II, as many African Americans in southern cities demanded that, they demanded their rights after fighting for the U.S. in a war. And Truman asked Congress to pass several measures for civil rights, but they constantly refused. Finally, Truman took things into his own hands and issued an executive order for the integration of the military and an end to discrimination in hiring government employees. We're going to see Truman kind of being the first active supporter of civil rights, but it will cost him some political support, especially from Southern Democrats. So in the 1948 election, this would be Truman's re-election year. Remember, he finished serving almost all of FDR's fourth term of office, since FDR died in office, and now Truman's up for re-election. A lot of Southern Democrats are very unhappy with Truman's push for civil rights, and to protest his actions, they formed their own political party called the States' Rights Democratic Party. Many of these members are commonly referred to as Dixiecrats, which is kind of a play on like Southern Democrats. This upset Truman, and he started even working harder to like get people on his side, but it would obviously cost him some votes. But he does win in kind of an upset against the Republican candidate whose last name, he was the governor of New York, but his name was Dewey, Thomas Dewey. This is a really cool picture because the newspapers were so certain that Truman would lose re-election because of the kind of split within the Democratic Party that they started printing off and acknowledging Dewey as the winner, when in fact Truman did defeat Dewey. This leads us to an event called the Red Scare. We've already kind of addressed what the Red Scare was, the fear that communism would make its way into the United States. These fears aren't completely unfounded. I mean, there was a communist party in the U.S., but it wasn't as popular as, the United States. It wasn't as popular as they would have needed to be to win in a U.S. election. But there was fear that there were spies working in the U.S. in higher places of government, kind of communicating with the Russians, with the Soviets, giving them information, especially when it came to our like atomic bomb and our military secrets. We do see like that the Soviets are able to construct their own atomic bomb in the few years after we did, which seemed a little bit too good to be true. Like they needed, they must have had inside help. And so a senator named Joseph McCarthy, and I know y'all talk about this a little bit with the Crucible, he is going to kind of expel on these fears, and things are going to become very kind of intense when he is in office as a senator and like is very outspoken against communists and the potential communist threat in government. He basically is going to start making one unsupported accusation after another, accusing people of being communists. He is pretty much going to engage in this witch hunt to root out all traces of communism in the U.S., in the military, in the state governments, in the federal government, in the State Department. People were afraid, and he's kind of playing on their fears. Most historians assume that McCarthy himself was trying to just win public support, win some re-elections, potentially make a bid for president himself. But eventually he accused the entire U.S. Army of being communist, and that's going to lead to a televised Senate investigation. And the reality is that investigation is going to turn up fruitless, which then just makes him look like a fool. And so people eventually realize that he was more or less playing into overall anxiety and not so much with anything like any type of real evidence. Okay, so the last section we'll quickly talk about is Truman's response to the Red Scare, not so much with civil rights, but specifically to that fear that communism was spreading. Initially, he was kind of accused of being soft on communism, and he creates something called the Loyalty Review Board, which was used to investigate government employees and dismiss those that were not loyal, or were deemed not loyal to the U.S. government, I should say. He also created something called HUAC, which stands for the House of Un-American Activities Committee. Here he investigated disloyalty outside of the government. One main avenue that HUAC began to investigate was the movie industry, because movie directors were accused of making films that were sympathetic to communism and to Russia. The funny thing is that they were kind of encouraged to make movies that were sympathetic to Russia during World War II because we were fighting with the Soviets. But now that was deemed, very unpatriotic and potentially pro-communist. And so it's very known that the movie industry was investigated thoroughly by the federal government. There were many trials to kind of sniff out sympathizers, and many people are blacklisted. And that's because of what HUAC's actions were. So the differences between the Loyalty Review Board is that the Loyalty Review Board was mainly looking at government employees, whereas HUAC was mainly looking at civilians. Our last note is a story in which there were actual spies in the United States working for the Russians, and that's in the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So in 1949, the Soviet Union was successful in making an operational atomic bomb. I mentioned that earlier. They successfully tested it, and that just seems a bit too soon. Scientifically, they should have needed more time to successfully construct that weapon, and so it looked like someone had given them or leaked information. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were members of the American Communist Party, and they were accused of leaking this information to the Soviet Union. They claimed innocence, but they were heavily investigated, and despite the lack of definite evidence, they were convicted and sentenced to death. They are the first civilians executed for espionage, being executed in the year 1953, which is just for perspective. We'll review some of this tomorrow, but please write down any questions you have, and I hope you all have a great evening.